The Lost Cause and San Antonio. Even though the Civil War ended 154 years ago, it still has influence in the South, even in the present day, with military bases, schools, counties named after Confederate officers. There are also still people who wave the Confederate flag due to heritage, white supremacy, racism, or to protest against the government under a rebel flag. The influence that still has influence in the South and makes the Confederate looks just and heroic is called the Lost Cause movement, which still has influence in San Antonio today. The Lost Cause movement was born after the turmoil of the American Civil War. The South was in ruins, with many towns losing many young men, many businesses investing in the now worthless Confederate dollar, and many cities and towns were devastated by the war's action. The South lost over 260,000 people, which is over 2% of the whole population of the Confederacy, and cost $3.3 billion. Many of the Southerners were devastated by the war's end, and they tried to console themselves, and many turned to the Lost Cause movement. The term Lost Cause was first coined by Edward Pollard in The Lost Cause in 1866. The book is mostly devoted to military battles. The other parts are dedicated to the ideas that the Lost Cause movement is about. Pollard stated in his book that neither slavery or the succession caused the Civil War, but the unavoidable clash between opposite civilizations. The rough and materialistic North demolishing the noble South, a culture of scholarship and manners. He also states that slavery was a wonderful thing and that blacks were lazy and reliable, but when enslaved they were cheerful and content and supported the Confederate cause. He also claims that the better men of the South would have won, but the Union Army, filled with the rowdies and roughs of the Union City, swarmed the outnumbered Confederate army with brute force. The North then tormented the South with Reconstruction policies designed to Africanize the South and create mongrellism. Pollard's book was immensely popular, selling 50,000 copies, and helped start the Lost Cause movement. In 1869, several Southern generals such as Braxton Bragg, Jubal Early, and Fitzhugh Lee formed a historical society called the Southern Historical Society to shape how future generations would understand the war, and they published the Southern Historical Society papers. In the book, they promoted several notions. The first one is that the South didn't start the war due to slavery, but because to preserve states' rights from federal tyranny. The next notion was that slavery was a benevolent institution in which slaves were treated with kindly, fairly, and they were protected from the dangers of life. They also promoted the notion that the Confederates were noble rebels, fighting a hopeless and lost cause against the overwhelming Union numbers. Yet they fought and gave their lives, which portrayed them as the true martyrs and the underdog heroes. Another notion was that the Confederates won battles due to the brilliant Robert E. Lee, and that Ulysses S. Grant was a clumsy butcher who only succeeded because of the total war to slaughter them in the dishonorable way. The societies and Edward Pollard gave the Lost Cause movement their basic tenets and cemented support for the movement. In 1877, the Reconstruction period ended. This meant that Southern conservatives resumed control of the state government. Many people, such as Henry Grady, promoted the idea of the New South. The idea is to diversify crops, as reliance on king cotton made them vulnerable to the Union, and to embrace industrialization. They built factories such as textile mills and lumber mills, planted tobacco and other crops, and improved the infrastructure with railroads and roads. There were also radical political changes as Southern residents turned to local leaders within the communities who became known as the Redeemers. They are called Redeemers because they are redeeming the South from being dominated by the North and moving the South from the cotton economy. Another goal of the Redeemers was to undo the progress of the Civil War and to reassert whites' dominance over the blacks. They implemented literacy tests and poll tax to prevent blacks from voting. In 1890, Mississippi posed harsher voting requirements as the residency rule, poll tax, literary test, and the grandfather clause, which made voting almost impossible for African Americans. Their laws were adopted by 7 other states over several years. The New South also promoted the idea of separate but equal, which meant that the segregation of whites and blacks were common with equal facilities. The southern states eventually legalized this in laws known as the Jim Crow laws. In the 1890s, many societies were formed. The two main ones were the United Sons of Confederate Soldiers and the United Daughters of the Confederacy. They embraced the Lost Cause tenets and celebrated the Confederate cause. The societies also erected many monuments, such as the Memorial to Confederate Soldiers and the Monument to Confederate Women, placed on the Arkansas State Capitol grounds. The use of state and local funds and placement in public places showed that the civic leaders accepted the society views of the war. They also influenced public school to ensure that their history of the war is taught and the Lost Cause views as part of the history. It sponsored programs in public schools, distributed pictures of Confederate heroes to be placed in classrooms, and sponsored poetry and essays contests to write about the Confederate past. In the early 20th century, the Lost Cause movement became mainstream in the media with books such as The Leopard Spots in 1902 and The Klansman in 1905. The first film to be released that supports Lost Cause movement would be The Birth of a Nation. In the movie, they portrayed the African Americans as a threat to democracy and white womanhood and glorified white supremacy and the Ku Klux Klan. Another example of Lost Cause literature is the famous book Gone with the Wind in 1936, which romanticized slavery and portrayed Southerners as a heroic and noble people in a romantic society which was destroyed by an unstoppable force. The book and movie Gone with the Wind romanticized the cause of the South and was immensely popular in America. In the 1950s to 1960s, the erection of Confederate monuments spiked due to the Civil Rights Movement, with roughly 25% of all monuments being built during or after the Civil Rights era. There are also more public displaying of the Confederate flag and the Ku Klux Klan officially embracing the Confederate flag. States also adopted Confederate designs on their flags, such as the present day flags of Mississippi, Georgia, and Tennessee. Support for the Lost Cause eventually waned after the passing of the Civil Rights Movement, but is still relevant due to racial tensions and societies such as the KKK. In 2015, the Charleston church shooting, in which a white supremacist and the desire to cause a race war murdered 9 African Americans. This caused the government to remove the Confederate statues created from the Lost Cause movement because they glorify white supremacy and memorialize a rebel government whose most important principle was slavery. This was generally opposed by the public and was met with protest and violence. The process of removing the monuments was greatly sped up by the Unite the Right rally in Charlottesville, which is a white supremacist rally which was broken up and gained controversy after a white supremacist rammed a car through a crowd of counter-protesters. Both of these events show that the Lost Cause still has influence in what happens today as their tenets are still apparent in the South. Before the Civil War, San Antonio had 8,000 citizens and 352 slaves. San Antonio was originally important for the defense of the U.S. frontier as 25% of the U.S. War Department went to Texas in the 1850s. Due to hostile Indians, and San Antonio was the headquarters. On the onset of the Civil War, General Twiggs, commander of all forces in Texas, was confronted by the Texas militia at the Alamo. Twiggs elected to surrender his forces and all his supplies to them. San Antonio supplied the Confederate cause in the Civil War, and even a politician, John Allen Wilcox, who resided in San Antonio, organized one of the most famous Southern brigades, the Texas Brigade. They served with distinction throughout the Civil War and were disbanded at the end of the Civil War. The Lost Cause didn't have much influence in San Antonio because after the war, the city flourished as a center for cattle trade and had a mixture of culture due to immigrants. The Lost Cause was still active in San Antonio because many veterans and politicians returned home to San Antonio with the ideals of the Lost Cause. The monument of a Confederate soldier was built in Travis Park in San Antonio in memory of the common soldier of the Confederacy. It stood there for 100 years, but was taken down secretly by the government due to recent controversy about white supremacy. Today, a chapter of the Sons of the Confederate Veterans and chapter of the United Daughters of the Confederacy are still active in the city today. In conclusion, the Lost Cause movement was the South's way to justify their actions in the Civil War as noble and honorable. Even though the Lost Cause movement was 150 years ago, it still has influence today with Confederate statues and monuments, the Confederate flag still being waved, and stuff named after Confederate officers. It's also present in San Antonio with locations named after Confederates, a cemetery dedicated to Confederates, and there was a statue dedicated to the common Southern soldier which was removed recently.